This is the Parallax podcast, and my name is Tom Amarque. In this mini-series, I interview the Swedish philosopher Alexander Bards on his worldview in general and his book Digital Libido in particular. Alexander Bards is a colorful character, being a proper philosopher, shaman, popstar, and entrepreneur. But as a shaman-philosopher, he looks deeply into our past, present, and future, laying out new narratives on the digital era, which is just now unfolding. In this 5-part mini-series, we will explore some of his core ideas. We start with a general introduction, followed by lectures on the relationship between man and technology, the phallus, spirituality, and power. In which sequence you listen to these episodes is completely up to you. This is a new format. I try to take a back seat and only facilitate guiding questions, so Alexander Bards had all the space to express and reveal his ideas. All the recordings took place in midst of the worldwide corona pandemic, which is quite obvious right now, but could create a context for the listeners in the years to come, because the internet won't forget. So, enjoy this mini-series, and if you indeed enjoyed it, please share it. Thank you for being on this podcast again, Alexander Bards. We had quite a run with different topics and different episodes about spirituality, sexuality, the phallus and stuff like that. And for this final episode, we decided to talk a little bit about power and how power shifts with the, upcoming or just developing internet sphere. And so I think the first question would be like, what is power?
Okay, if you're a man and you say power is not important to you, then as soon as you approach a woman, you will be reminded that power is incredibly important to you.
Right.
Because she would demand of you that you exercise some kind of power. I would say today we can't even talk about power without starting with Nietzsche. And this, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche is the philosopher of will to power. And what Nietzsche sees in nature is this inherent will to establish some kind of power, because if you don't, then you just die. That's why Nietzsche is a close relative to Darwin, right? You can't read 19th century philosophical history without starting with Hegel, but Darwin, Freud, Nietzsche, they're all the sons of Hegel, right? Without Hegel, none of them would be around. So will to power is this will to express something. And that's what Nietzsche sees in nature. So that's something we share with plants and animals and all other life forms out there. And the way it's then exercised in human beings is the interesting question for Nietzsche. Nietzsche works still within what I would call the sort of post-Cartesian, post-Kantian paradigm here, meaning that he is the guy who's most likely to accomplish and fulfill the Kantian revolution all the way. The Kantian revolution is that with Immanuel Kant, you realize that actually the world is not accessible to you as it is. The noumenal world out there is not accessible to you. You make up a world in your own mind, the phenomenological world, and you turn whatever is out there, the old different fields of intensities as we call them, into objects or phenomena. And this, of course, phenomenology. It starts with Kant and then later with Hegel. It's just a huge field of philosophy starting with Kant. So Kant, we owe it to Kant that the field of phenomenology exists in philosophy today. So the Kantian revolution is also the accomplishment of whatever you could do with the Cartesian individual. You know, this idea that I think, therefore I am. There's like a sense of self inside of me. So if you take that idea all the way, then Kant achieves that revolution. Now, what kind of character would that then be? Well, what Nietzsche does is that he gives a name to a character who is completely uncompromising about his own desire and his own drive. And he calls this character the Übermensch. So he puts the individual like on a mountain. And if you read Also sprach Zarathustra, for example, with Nietzsche, you see that he plays around with this game of the character who is the complete and fulfilled individual. And obviously he breaks with Protestant Christianity in the process, because Christianity says you need to serve a God. And he says that, no, I am the God myself, or if there is no God and God's over, that means the death of God is the birth of the individual. And this is, of course, a paradigm in itself. And the question I was obsessed with when I started studying this in the 1990s, my background was that I'd studied Foucault before that. I studied power structures, and I started reading Nietzsche through Foucault. And Foucault is like a Nietzschean who's a reverse Nietzschean. So whereas Nietzsche says that, why are there so few masters out there, people who want to be masters of their own destiny? Why are there so many people out there who want to be slaves? Today, we would probably refer to René Girard and then say that, why are there so many people out there who mimic each other all the time instead of trying to create something novel?
Right.
Because a master, obviously, is a master of novelty, whereas just if you mimic other people all the time, if you're just mimicking what other people do, if you mimic their own desires, if you buy a cup of coffee because somebody told you in a commercial you should buy a cup of coffee, you are a slave.
Right.
You don't even have your own desire in that case. So we see this Girard today. He's a brilliant Nietzschean, right? And he studies power structures that way. But if you take Foucault, who studied the slave, what is it that the slave loves about being a slave? Which is something that Nietzsche avoided. But Foucault exposed that in the 1960s and 1970s, said that, there's a lot of pleasure you get out of licking somebody's ass. It's just like, isn't it wonderful that somebody just walked into the room and told you what to do? So you don't have to be an individual any longer. You don't have to obey somebody else. You can just immerse yourself in the joy of being a masochistic slave to somebody who sadistically controls you and does whatever he wants with you, right? So there was enormous pleasure in this that Foucault was interested in. And he did a beautiful job. That's why today you read Nietzsche through Foucault and Girard, and you add to this sense of the will to power that there's also a will to submit to power.
Right.
Okay, then it gets really interesting. So when I started doing this in the 1990s, I was more like interested in, okay, but what kind of character is this? And where does this Cartesian individual that Nietzsche then transforms and puts on top of things, where does it come from? And I discovered that it was because of the printing press that came out of Germany in the 1450s, and later was established in France and Germany, and all of modern Europe was established on it. The European era of history that came right after that, over the next 300 years. And first Portugal and the Netherlands, and later Germany, France and Britain conquered the world and established their empires across the world. And over half the planet was colonized by the Europeans. And they even conquered another further 3 continents and populated after that. So the European era was based on this one innovation, and that was the printing press in Germany in 1450.
Right.
And if you think about it, in the 1600s, in the 17th century, you'd have a lot of people around Europe who usually were urban and lived in cities. And they were sitting at night with a little lamp on, probably some whale oil in it or something, and they were reading a book. It was no longer a book that somebody read to you in a church that was handwritten. This is a book that you'd bought yourself. And then somebody had read it loud for you for 100 years. And then finally you discovered you don't need a monk or none to read it loud for you, because you can read loud for yourself. Then you discover that you don't even have to read it loud. You can read the book quietly. And the whole experience was so intensely personal that it's me and the book. And of course, this is the environment that's perfect for the Reformation in Northern Europe as well. It's perfect for Protestantism, Calvinism, Lutheranism. All these new ideas come out of the idea that you can have a direct relationship with God because you have a direct relationship with the text. And if the text is the Word of God, which the church claims it is, then the text speaks directly to you. So why would anybody else interpret the text except for you?
Right.
That's why Nietzsche comes out of Protestantism. He's breaking with his own father, who was a Protestant minister in Germany, but he ends up being another Protestant minister who says that, okay, if the text tells me what I should submit to, why do I not write that text myself? Why is that not a text about me? That's
right.
The way Derrida would interpret Nietzsche, for example. So we get a whole idea that, oh, wait a second, I'm sitting here.
So there's an element of self-creation in there, of autopoiesis. So
you wouldn't even say the term self-creation unless you were European post-Protestant, post-Nietzsche.
Right.
The idea of self-creation through an artistic or creative experience of any kind could not exist outside of this paradigm. So power changes and it shifts. And the question is, why does it shift? Well, then you look at the map of Europe, you look at the topology of Europe, and you realize, wait a second, power used to be in the countryside. And then I discovered, if you read it, use a little Karl Marx onto this, the map of Europe. you discover that, okay, there's a shift here. So the printing press arrives and people live in a rural world. They go to church on Sundays. Somebody reads from a text who can read. And because of that, they have an authority. They have a symbolic power. They own the word. They own the text. They call the priest. It's the Catholic Church, right? Then somebody owns the land on which you work as a slave. It's a feudalist society. So somebody owns that land, and aristocracy owns the land. And the aristocracy and the church then together report to the crown, the monarchy, the king. And the king goes to war, and the king owns the territory. And you have a triad that's very stable over time. And then you discover that any culture you looked at throughout world history, where you have written language but not printed language yet, will have a power structure that looks exactly like that. Land ownership, an imaginary power, which is the crown or monarchy, and a symbolic power, which is a church or a mosque or a synagogue that produces the official truth. And these three powers will not interfere with each other's interests. And whenever one of them gets a little bit too cocky and want to stand up against the other two are united, and then you reestablish a relationship between the three. This is why triads, power triads over time, are always stable. Okay, so that's the power structure. Now what happens is that since you no longer go to the church on a Sunday, you don't even live in the rural countryside any longer. You started moving into an urban environment. You start moving to cities. And once you arrive in a city, you discover that all the other people in the city, they read their own books. They even start printing a book every day called a newspaper or a tabloid. They even start publishing books that have all the knowledge of the world, like all the libraries of the world, into one book called an encyclopédie in French, right? The encyclopedias, right? All of this arrives. And the first place where this happens full scale is, of course, Paris in the 1780s, leading up to the French Revolution. Literally, Paris in the 1780s was the first city in the world where over half the population could read and write. It also happened that France had half the population of Western Europe in the 1780s. So, of course, this was like the center of the world. The French Revolution had enormous effects on everything that happened. And of course, the philosophers loved it. Kant and Hegel, they loved the French Revolution. Kant said the French Revolution will change everything forever. Hegel said out of the French Revolution came Napoleon. And then Hegel said Napoleon is the shit. We just need to copy and follow him because he personifies the zeitgeist. He personifies exactly the printing press, which Napoleon literally did. What Napoleon did was that he created the first army where it was mandatory that even the cannon fodder at the bottom of the hierarchy must be able to read, write, and count. That's why his army was so successful. And then, of course, Germany, France, Britain, all these new European superpowers created in the 19th century a world with immense population growth, colonization of three other continents, the conquering of the planet, the most successful colonization imperial project ever. Several small European countries became worldwide empires over 100 years. And after the Napoleonic War between 1815 and up to 1912, over almost 100 years, Europe lives most at peace, except for a few small border conflicts. And during this period, Europe excels. And it invents mass education because of the printing press. But this is a whole new power structure. Wait, what happens with the symbolic power? Do you still go to the church? No. You go to the university. The irony is, of course, the universities came out of churches because the first thing they would study was theology. But from the 1600s forward, they separate theology and philosophy to begin with, so the state and the church are not the same thing. Then out of philosophy comes science, and out of science comes social sciences and everything. And finally, the universities are basically producing any kind of truth that can be applicable on a modern society. So we still live with this idea today that academic institutions produce professors. These are experts, and we go to the professors for guidance because nobody else is allowed to speak their mind.
Right, but
okay?
At the same time,
academia takes over that. So it's a power structure. It's a new power structure. But once that symbolic power is in place, you can no longer have the old imaginary power. So finally, in Europe in the 19th century, we get rid of the kings and the monarchs and the queens and the courts, which started, of course, with Versailles in 1789. And instead, we introduce republics with presidents and prime ministers and eventually democracies. And we vote because we read books. Then we entitle those a vote. And we go and vote every 4 years for politicians. Politics takes over from the monarchy, new power structure. And then finally, we get rid of the aristocratic landlords because owning countryside is no longer profitable or meaningful. But the guy who owns the factory or owns the stock in the company that owns the factory is the bourgeoisie. Power structure. So this is what's important, because especially now with the internet is such a drastic and dramatic revolution. And what we've seen since the 1980s is that the old structure is falling apart.
Right. So, but at the same time and parallel to this process you just described, right?
Yeah.
So there's this Nietzschean ideal of the Übermensch and of perfect self-authorship and self-authority and sovereignty. And that is because all the forces and power structures the person was subjected to before, like church, and so was getting internalized. So the individual at that point, the perfect realized Übermensch, was put forth as an ideal by Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And so this is a process which goes parallel. And so the question then is, how does this ideal exposes themselves or goes into the upcoming internet age?
Well, it doesn't work. And that's exactly my point against Nietzsche. Nietzsche is perfect. He even writes a book called The Antichrist.
Right.
He knows that he's the antithesis, in Hegelian sense, against the thesis, which is Christianity. So he breaks with Christianity, and he completes the break with Christianity, which Descartes and Kant didn't dare to do. He's taken the Cartesian Kantian individual seriously, and then takes that idea all the way, which is what philosophers are supposed to. Now, the problem is this. That worked wonderfully because you became a Nietzschean individual. You became a perfect American robber baron.
Right.
That's exactly what the Nietzscheans in France in the 1960s and 1970s, like Deleuze and Foucault, these guys were not Marxists, they were Nietzscheans, right? Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault. The irony is when the Americans badmouth them, that is actually these are the very guys who became stars in America, because in France and in Europe in the 1970s, they basically said that the American individual is essentially the Nietzschean Übermensch accomplished.
Oh, right.
So the American state religion is Cartesian individualism.
Right.
And the most vulgar version of it is, of course, Ayn Rand in her books. Like Ayn Rand is not a proper Nietzschean. She's an objectivist or whatever. But she's the perfect way of reading Nietzsche the wrong way. The bad way of reading Nietzsche the wrong way is Adolf Hitler. The good way of reading Nietzsche the wrong way in a vulgar way is Ayn Rand. But philosophically speaking, Ayn Rand or Adolf Hitler are about on a par with each other because they completely misunderstand the Nietzschean Übermensch. Because the Nietzschean Übermensch is a real effort to become the Nietzschean Übermensch. Because obviously to stand on your own shoulders, to be divine in a sense, is of course incredibly difficult and quite likely impossible, right? But
I think that's the whole gist of it.
It's just a declaration that if I'm a Nietzschean Übermensch, I'm a Nietzschean Übermensch. It's just like, it's just narcissism and nothing else. But
we all strive to become better, and so this is like the meta idea.
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. I'd say if you strive to become better, you're still stuck with individualism. So I'm not saying, I'm just questioning that you don't actually have to become better, because then you have to hate your old past. And you don't want to do that. So we can look at that later. But the question is, what did I see as a Nietzschean when I saw the internet arrive in the 1990s, when I started to write as a philosopher? And this first book we wrote, The Netocrats, is therefore a merger of Nietzsche and Marx, which is kind of weird. No, it isn't, because Marx was the best guy at providing class analysis, which is understanding power structure, whereas Nietzsche was the philosopher of will to power, as, of course, the Übermensch, as a form of individualism. But the question was here, does the internet provide another age of individualism, or is it exactly the opposite? And then we said, it's very likely that the internet will be perceived as a medium for the individual. So we predicted over the next 30 years, you'll have lots of children's diseases with the internet, where people mistakenly think that the internet is finally my chance to shine. So people will think of the internet as a Broadway stage where everybody goes up there and has their own Instagram account, their own Facebook account, their own Twitter account. I am the most interesting person in the world. I'm the Nietzschean Übermensch. You must all now listen to me. And of course, we know what happened. 8 billion people, more or less, theoretically at least, went up on the stage with their megaphones and started screaming at each other, and there wasn't any audience left. Right. Well, if you read guys like me who said that you're not going to understand the internet for a long time, this is starting in 1998, because the internet is a very different environment. And if you think about this properly in a Marxist way, you realize that the rural environment dictated the conditions for a feudalist society. I say feudalist and not feudal. Please note that. Feudalism is the idea that the church controls truth production, the aristocracy controls land production, the crown controls the nation, and together, this is all about land ownership and farming. Right. It's an agricultural economy and an agriculture. It's a culture based on agriculture. Now, if agriculture is not the dominant mode of production any longer, but industry is taken over, you live in a society that's industrialist. Now, in an industrialist society, what kind of ideal would you have for workers? Because you're going to fool the workers into a factory. You're going to pay them, some money to go to the factory every day. Well, you don't want them to be slaves like they were in the farms in the good old days, and you had to pay for them 24 hours a day. So you basically abolish slavery, claim you did a good thing, and instead tell people, I'm only going to pay for you 8 hours a day rather than 24 hours a day. And then you call it a factory. Okay? So we all believed that abolishing slavery was a nice thing. So we could all be individuals. So we were all sold this idea that we could be these individuals. And then with the internet rise in the 1980s, actually the internet only fosters one successful model, and it's called subculture. The only thing that works on the internet, interesting enough, is precisely how we used to live 10,000 years ago, which is as tribes. So, a friend of mine, Peter Lindbergh, we both know him in Canada, has written on mimetic tribes. Why don't you read him? It's all about tribes these days. And we predicted, 25 years ago that the internet revolution will bring humanity back to a very tribal society. That's exactly what we've seen. In the 2010s, we saw the tribes explode, echo chambers, that's what we call them, in a derogatory manner. But the only thing that works online is we're comfortable. Is a group of, say, 250 people who basically share the same interest, have a slight difference of opinions about details so they can have an ongoing debate about things, but are actively engaged or involved in creating something together.
Right. So, okay,
this is why we talk.
Let me ask one thing, because, how, like, as an endearing idea, the Nietzschean Übermensch.
Yeah.
If you look at say, like, social justice warrior tribe in the internet. Yeah. Right? That would seem to me not like as a Übermenschian tribe, but more like a victim tribe or something.
Very
like
Rousseau, very Rousseau. So you go back to the French Revolution, the Jacobins, and you see exactly what that is.
So, but how would an Übermenschian tribe look like in the?
It would be the exact opposite. So it would be a tribe that cherishes the heroic, and that's exactly what you see in the 2010s. You saw people out there who created communities that were heroic. You and I are parts of several of these communities. We are parts of the European men's movement and things like that too. And Wilberian, if you're Wilberian, you read Ken Wilber. There's no way you can encourage a Rousseauian lynch mob or a Rousseauian self-victimization cult through that process. Right. So the social justice warriors appeared in the 2010s, precisely with the internet had been around for 20 years. And there were so many people who've been promised that finally they get a gold star from the mother for being little good boys or little good girls performing on a theater stage. And it was after 20 years of trying to get attention, this is an attentionalist society, remember, of trying to get attention and failing, that these failure guys found each other. So if you look at all the social justice warrior mobs out there, they're all failures. They were all failures of being the Nietzschean micro-Übermensch.
Right.
They failed. They didn't get followers. They didn't create value for others. They weren't interesting. And if they ever got any followers, it was basically as a freak show.
Okay, but
these guys then became the social justice warrior mobs, and we're going to have them around for a long time because nobody's explained to them that you're never going to win. All you can do is to cause havoc and throw your anger and your envy and all these negative attitudes onto the world. And that's exact opposite of Nietzsche's idea.
Well, Nietzsche's idea was like, one of his ideas was do not complain, do something, be heroic, as you said.
Yes.
And so you have to, you think it would be a good measure to look for heroic tribes and, to have this distinction in the first place. Are you a victim? Are you a victim of society? Are you a victim of societal structures, or are you actually engaging with them in a sense to rejuvenate, to create them, and stuff like that? To be more heroic, is that a proper distinction you would use for internet tribes?
Yeah. So what is lacking in Nietzsche, which is ironic, because one of Nietzsche's most famous one-liners is that there's nothing less than two. Okay, what is lacking in Nietzsche is that Übermensch is alone.
That what? I didn't get
He
that.
should, the Ubermensch, okay. What's ironic about Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is famous for the one-liner, there is nothing less than two in the world.
Right.
He's a precursor to white-head relationalism when he says that. But ironically, his own ideal is the lonely Ubermensch.
Right.
So the first thing you should say to Nietzsche, looking back, is that, wait, there should be at least two Ubermensches. And Ubermensch is something you can only be in collaboration with at least one more person.
Well, because it's kind of a chauvinistic thing to declare yourself an Übermensch. It has to...
No, it's because you're human. Humans are flock animals, and we're tribal, and we don't accomplish anything unless there's at least two. We can't breed babies without being at least two. Actually, it's more like at least 5 or at least 10, and usually 157. You got the Dunbar number, and you got the clan. And the clan is the clan is where you start when you work towards a larger tribe and a smaller family. So the words family, clan, and tribe exist in just about every language and different versions of it. And family is just a smaller size than clan, so clan can be more mobile. Tribe is just sense that clan, so clan can be protected. So whatever territory you have is tribal. Whatever unit you operate according to is clan-like. And within the clan, you've got family, which is what your responsibility is. And we are contributive and collaborative animals. So being human means you're contributive. It's like you go and kill yourself unless you contribute, unless you find your own archetype within the tribe. So you can contribute. You don't want to be human. You don't want to live, right? So you get value out of contributing to the tribe. And you contribute collectively, not collectively, I'd say it's the wrong word because we think Stalinism. You contribute through collaboration, okay? So you collaborate and contribute. So the problem with Nietzsche today, if you apply Nietzsche on the online world, is that it's exactly the guy who only talks about himself all the time and declares things that you get bored with because he doesn't interact with other people out there.
Right.
It's like following somebody on Twitter who's really good at tweeting. So you do follow him. You discover that he doesn't follow anybody else. Then you discover he's just using Twitter as a megaphone. And that's precisely what you're bored with now.
Right.
It's like, okay,
so now
interact with me, then why do I bother talking to him, right?
Right.
So the internet is all about interactivity. It's all about collaboration. That's what we talk constantly in our work about a return to the tribe and understanding anthropology in a deep way again, and understanding how we were nomadic in the past, to then go back and say, can we learn all these things from human history for the past 30, 40,000, 200,000 years, if you like, about what it means to be human, and then create models for how do you win? How do you become powerful in the online world?
Exactly. That would be my next question. So, like, what is the power that is exerted by those heroic tribes, and how do they do that in relationship to this, say, Rousseauian social justice tribes, or the tribes which, don't follow a heroic ideal?
Well, the funny thing is that both the two dominant ideologies of the past are now in a state of array and are falling apart. That means both individualism and collectivism are dying. None of them work. Collectivism ended up as North Korea. Okay, sure. It's a huge tragedy for North Koreans. For the rest of it, it's nothing but the weirdest freak show ever. I mean, we all want to have reality television cameras now following Kim Jong-un every day because it's like even Tiger King looks reasonable compared to North Korea. So if that doesn't speak volumes about where Stalinism ended up, then I don't know what to do. And of course, this is still the problem with communist China. We have this enormous problem with dictatorships. We need to again rework the concepts of plurality and the world of philosophy. Superior to dictatorial cultures. Okay, so how does that work? Well, to begin with, you cannot contribute and collaborate, you're not listening. And dictators are not listening. Okay, so they're failures ultimately. You can only mimic in a culture like communist China. You cannot really create anything novel or valuable. You can't do that. You can only mimic. You can only copy. You cannot do anything else in dictatorship. So collectivism is dead. But the problem is also that individualism is dead. And all you need to say is that as soon as you get a newsletter in your mailbox today from somebody who talks about themselves, so this is a person who talks about themselves, saying, I'm on tour right now, or I'm doing this, and I made this proclamation, I made this, and look at all the good grades I got, and all the good reviews I got for my behavior and all that. And by the way, buy my product at the end of the email. What is the first thing you do with a personal newsletter? It's the first thing you throw away and call spam. You kill it. I mean, it's your algorithm will help kill all individuals.
Right.
Okay. So individualism is over. And the funny thing is, the country, of course, that benefited the most from individualism was the United States of America. That's why it's so damn hard for Americans to accept it, because they pretend to be Baptists or Protestants or Episcopalians or Catholics or Buddhists or whatever, and they go to church on Sundays at 11. But in reality, the only American religion ever was individualism.
Right.
And if you look at the distortions of Christianity that the Americans created, which are called Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, and Mormonism, you'd see how weirder and weirder and stranger they get. I mean, Scientology is on a par with North Korean Stalinism. It's just individualism taken to its absolute extreme. It's like, you're going to get the ultimate self-help book, and we're going to send you to another planet when you die, and so your soul's going to survive. And by the way, pay us $1,000 for the service.
Right.
It's just Scientology. Scientology is just individualism taken to its absolute extreme. So then you see where individualism would end up anyway. And do you want to be a North Korean Stalinist, or do you want to be a Californian Scientologist?
Of course not.
No, but that's where we ended up with the entire last paradigm. Now, of course, I would not invest too much in that power structure going forward, because sooner or later people will realize that Scientology and North Korean Stalinism are not such attractive options. They don't want to be there. So what does the internet then teach us? If we reflect ourselves as humans, and we understand better what it means to be human through anthropology, then we look at the technology and we said, how can we interact with the internet in the optimal way? The term for this is symbiotic intelligence. That's why I talk much more about symbiotic intelligence than artificial intelligence, because it's not so interesting what the machine does. What's interesting is the relationship between us and the machine.
Right.
This relationship with symbiotic intelligence will throw us back into the arms of other human beings. The first thing the machine will tell us is that you're good at being human. Can you please allow me to be good at being a machine?
Right. Okay, but let's, you didn't answer quite my question. So like, what is the power exerted by the heroic online tribe?
Oh, it's enormous. To begin with, it survives the victimhood tribe enormously. The problem with victimhood tribes, like say Adolf Hitler, is Adolf Hitler ruled Germany and half Europe for 11 years, and he was responsible for killing 100 million people at the end of the day, but he only lasted for 11 years. Okay. Akhenaten in Egypt, the original Hitler, yeah, he outlived everybody and died, but his son Tutankhamun had a few years before the priests of Egypt decided to kill Tutankhamun, because they just got rid of it. They were tired of Atonism, which Atonism was a new religion in Egypt, a monotheistic religion. It was actually absolute and total dictatorship. Okay, so all these, the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Mussolinis and the Mao Zedongs of the world are all copies of Akhenaten. That's what I have to recognize. So they're lonely dictators, right? And that's another story of what will not work. So what will work is that you start in the heroic tribe where you basically ban self-victimization. That's what you learn from Nietzsche. So what Nietzsche says with amor fati is that you got to get up in the morning every day, sit and meditate or contemplate, forgive history for everything that has happened until now, and just completely accept it. Do not ever think hypothetically that life could be any different from what it is. Don't waste time on that. It's a total waste of time. It's precisely when you start thinking the world could have been different. If only this had happened, only that had happened, life would be different. Well, it didn't. Tough shit, but you got to live with the world as it is. This is called amor fati.
Right.
And by accepting that, you don't allow self-victimization, because self-victimization always starts with the assumption that life could have been different or should have been different. And if it only had been different, you then have the right to claim something now that compensates for life having been bad with you. But the problem with that is there is no end to the compensation, because history cannot be redone.
Okay, so now we're getting to the thick of it, because amor fati, I really like that concept. But you can also make it's brilliant. But you can also make the claim that it's quite a Buddhistic notion, or like even a developmental psychological notion. So because the capacity to not interfere, to just let things play out and just let them as they are, to love fate,
to love, but that's not Nietzsche. Yeah, but that's not Nietzsche's point. Yeah, but that's not Nietzsche's point. It's called amor fati. So you're right in understanding it literally like love of fate, but it's actually acceptance of fate with Nietzsche.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's just accepting and then act.
Yeah, but it's still a mental capacity to do that and not to interfere, because like talking about our daily lives and daily routines, we like to interfere. We like to, mess with fate.
Yeah.
And so, and we're not accepting it at all. And so
No,
that is quite
no, but that's not Nietzsche's point at all. This is only fate up until now.
right.
So what Nietzsche says is that you become the Nietzschean individual precisely by acting on that information, interacting with the world, and therefore you become fate itself. So you, through your will, exercise an effect on fate,
Right.
fate for others to begin with. You become part of that. For Nietzsche, you interact with the world. So amor fati with Nietzsche is not the sort of Buddhist, just sit there and accept everything and let it pass by, don't interfere with it. Not at all. No, it's acceptance of everything as it has been up until now, including you and who you were and everything you did.
Yeah, but
So
nobody,
there's no
like
sin.
who can do that? That's like quite a mental feat to be able to do that.
I try to do it every morning. I'm a Zoroastrian, so this is a Zoroastrian idea. This is just Asha. You accept Asha. And Taoists do the same thing as called the Tao. You sit and meditate on it, and then you start interacting with the world, including why don't you make yourself a cup of coffee to begin with? Be nice to yourself. Start there. Then do all your duties and make sure you got them over and done with. That's a Kantian side of you. And after that, you're free to do other things. And that's when you hopefully explore the world and exercise and or do something creative. Right? Or make love to somebody, whatever. And then you go to bed. And then the next day you sit up again and you do your amor fati routine. In Zoroastrianism, this is called Asha and Asha Vahishta. And then which is the Persian tradition. If you go to the Chinese tradition, it's called the Tao. I'm sure there's similar traditions of Buddhism, because in the Eastern tantric religions, these things are practiced. And the point is not to be passive. Maybe the Buddhist sits a little longer than the other guys and just trains himself to accept completely before he acts. But at the end of the day, you go back into the world and you interact with the world. And this is what we can use today. All we need to do is to stretch this a little further and say it's not about you, and it's not about you interacting with the world. It's about you interacting with other human beings, that you together with them, you interact with the world.
Right.
That's Nietzschean tribal. Right. And that's when you get into our philosophy, like what Söderqvist and I work with. That's precisely what we do. We are absolute Nietzscheans, but we move Nietzsche into a new paradigm because the internet has arrived. Now, Nietzsche wouldn't have known. I mean, Nietzsche wrote the right thing. If newspapers were around and maybe radio and television was waiting around the corner, this is the late 1800s and the early 20th century, and that's when Nietzsche lived, then it makes sense that he just completed the Cartesian Kantian revolution by even turning it against Christianity and declaring a new religion, which is individualism. And of course, it caught on in America. There were vulgar versions of it too, but this idea that you would establish your will to power, and you would make a mark on the world. Any American robber baron, any American entrepreneurial spirit, all the Zuckerbergs, the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gateses of the world are all Nietzscheans in this sense, right? But today, that's no longer feasible, because since the 1980s, a whole new technology and a new way of communicating came along, where the ultimate power does not reside with the guy who believes in himself, and only the underclass read the self-help books or go into the self-victimization cults, and the heroic has now moved on to a tribe. And that's your subculture you create. And if you create a heroic subculture, it's likely to, outlast any sort of self-victimhood cult out there, by years and years and years.
Right.
Because it's precisely the netocrats, as we call them in our work. It's precisely the people with a netocratic attitude towards life. It's like, I'm going to create my own mimetic tribe, and I'm going to have this tribe, this subculture, and it's going to be circling around some kind of creative idea, unifies the people involved with it, and we're going to have a zero tolerance policy towards self-victimization.
Right.
And rather, we're going to look for the heroic at all times. How can we be stronger than what we are?
Right.
That's the Nietzschean proper approach towards the internet.
So let's talk a little bit about the netocrats then.
Yeah.
About this. How would you describe them? It's not really part of the Digital Libido, but you wrote a book about the netocrats itself.
Yeah, the first book he wrote was The Netocrats. That was the year 2000. And we were asked at the time, can you please name us the Netocrats? We say it's too early. We're basically saying this is what the new technology is going to foster. So if a new dominant mode of interactivity arrives and we leave then the urban and move to the digital, the same way we left the rural and moved to the urban, that means we move to the digital. And I think it's getting pretty obvious for people after the corona pandemic that we have more or less moved to digital as a dominant mode of communicating with others, a dominant mode of being. Okay,
Right.
So we leave for the digital, meaning physical space has become redundant. You can basically live anywhere you like on the planet, go online, and you're in the digital realm right away. And the question is, who's the winner there? Well, it's not an individual any longer. Okay, so it's somebody who successfully, tribally collaborates with other people.
Right.
He's not a collectivist. He's not an individualist. No, he's a tribalist. Okay?
Right.
So it's digital, tribal. Okay, makes sense. Now, what kind of power structure would you then see materialize? And we wrote about it already in the Netocrats 20 years ago, and we're going to return to it in our next book because we can now develop this theory much more fully 20 years later. I would say you would see a repetition of a certain symbolic power. So we'd have a symbolic netocracy. You would see a certain repetition of imaginary
How would that
power.
look like?
Wait a second. You have an imaginary netocracy, and you'd have a repetition of a real power, a real netocracy. And what we mean real netocracy is basically real in a Lacanian sense. It's real that it owns the assets. That's the first netocracy you would see. So in 2005 or so, Jan Söderqvist and I said, I think it was an Italian interview, we said that we can now name a couple of netocrats. They're called Sergey Brin and Larry Page. They founded Google. Why? Because they built their entire power base on what's eventually going to be the world's biggest company, which it became, by just collecting data and then processing the data and then creating algorithms and therefore creating a phallic guide through the chaos of the internet. Google search, okay? So they were highly successful. They did exactly that. They collected the data and started organizing the data using machines to organize the data in creating machinic, eventually messianic algorithms. They're all private algorithms now. Your algorithm, my algorithm, depending on what we use, right?
Right.
And we then have a tribal algorithm because if you and I have the same interest when we go to YouTube, I will discover that, oh, wait a second, this is probably something that Tom likes a lot because it just popped up in my algorithm because
Right.
Tom and I have such similar tastes and we belong to the same networks.
Right.
That's exactly where algorithms are heading. Algorithms are becoming more and more tribal now. They're no longer individual, no longer collective. They go more and more towards tribal.
Right.
So that's a natural thing to happen. That is the first netocracy. That's a real netocracy that's already there. It's Silicon Valley, Seattle, tech startups, tech hubs around the world, all these technology companies we talk about. That's the first netocracy there. It's the real netocracy. But you will also have an imaginary and a symbolic netocracy. And the way to look at them is that they will knock out the previous symbolic and imaginary power. Okay. So you now got a friend called Thaddeus Russell, for example, in California.
Right.
He runs something called the Renegade University. That has inspired you and me and Andrew Sweeney to try to formulate a Parallax Academy that we are about to launch here in Europe. We're part of that. Okay. What are these new attempts of creating sort of digital monasteries? What are they about? Well, they're about killing universities. Why would you need the Harvards and the Stanfords at the end of the day? Well, Harvard and Stanford and Oxford probably survives longer than any of the other ones out there, but thousands and thousands of universities will go down and disappear over the next 10 years. That's granted, because we discovered that higher education has become useless. We can learn anything from the online world anyway. We can have all the world's best lectures. And if you pay a fee, you get an organized package of lectures you should go through to finally then go and take a test somewhere. And you take that test, and at a cost that is like a 10th of a year at Harvard, you get a better education than Harvard could ever offer. So it's just a given that this will happen. Now, it's not just only that we kill the universities. That's for granted. That means the universities will be gone, but that creates a vacuum for a symbolic netocracy. And at the end of the day, the symbolic netocracy will be the very people who write the narrative about the new online world.
Right.
So when you and I sit here and talk and we discuss with others out there, how do you become a successful guy online, and how do you create a successful, heroic tribe that people want to join and be part of? Well, I work with it for the past 30 years. That's what I do. Basically saying I'm basically a Nietzschean prophet who tries to tell the new elite how they're going to live their lives to become a new elite. So we have somebody else to mimic. Basically, who are going to be the masters of the online world? This is what you need to do. And that's, when it comes to narrative, whoever writes that story, whoever provides the grand narrative that can make people become cosmopolitan, so they collaborate on a global scale, to become ecotopians, so they save the damn nature and save the planet so it's sustainable and we can live on it, and whoever can become experimentalists. Like, how can you maintain a lifestyle where you encourage yourself to not only accept fate every morning, but also stay in a creative mode throughout your life and be a creative person?
Right.
Now, these are all the ideals of synthesis. These are all the ideals of the internet world today. And what we're basically trying to do in our work is to, just step forward and be philosophers out there who say, this is what the internet requires of you to be successful.
Right. I mean,
a human interacting with a machine, right? Then the last one is imaginary. And this is the interesting thing. While everybody's obsessed with politics these days and talks about politics, they haven't discovered, one, that politics is far less powerful than it used to be. Two, powerful has become completely theatrical.
Right.
Okay? Since it is theatrical and no longer real in any meaningful sense, obviously it has lost a lot of power. So people are not discussing, they're not discussing the fact that the entire zone of politics has got a lot smaller and less influential. The question is, where has power moved then? Where is power now? Well, it's certainly with the algorithms. Okay. That means whoever can process data in an advanced way, which we call AI today, would then be the third autocracy. We would go to the machine and ask the machine to rule and control us.
So I mean, like you're talking about old power structures and the theatrical aspect of the old power structure. So, like, if you had to look in the future, how many decades or centuries it will take for to completely shift the power structures into the internet?
I would say that after the corona pandemic is over, you would see definitely that Jeff Bezos is way more powerful than the president of the United States. So the shift has then happened. Undoubtedly so. As soon as you see that the new structure is more powerful than the old one, that's just something you have to accept. And there's no way back. Okay? Right. Once you are a powerful digital overlord, you cannot be kicked by any pre-digital system.
Right.
That's impossible.
Okay.
So politics will die, academia will die, industry will die.
Yeah, but how long will it take till
Oh, it's already happening. It's already happening. The question is rather, we ask in Digital Libido, the question is, would the new elite want us even to know? Or are they actually more interested in not telling us and therefore take over the world without us interfering? Well, it turns out that a lot of people in Silicon Valley bought property in New Zealand. They claim it's because in case there's an atomic war, then atomic bombs fly through the sky, then New Zealand will be the safest place on the planet to live. I'm not sure that's the only case. It's probably that they're also neighbors in New Zealand and they no longer live in California. So they're already moving somewhere else. They're just discreetly doing it. And we write about the new elite are probably going to be voyeuristic because everybody else is an exhibitionist these days. So it's very likely that the new power elite today are not interested in communicating with the vast majority of people because they don't need human slaves. They will have machines as their slaves.
Right.
So the question is, what are you going to do with the vast majority of people of the planet? Well, you leave them in an ever-increasing, growing service sector, badly paid, looking after each other, entertaining themselves to death as a new digital underclass that we call the consummariat. The trick is this: the netocrats are no longer dependent on the consummariat. So the scary thing with the digital power structure is that you have a new elite that is no longer depending on the old underclass, the underclass. And in the past, you would just put them to work in factories. So before that, you put them to work in the farms of the world. The problem we got today is that all you got left to do is that they become nurses or couriers or whatever. You just got to basically a few jobs out there. But for the vast majority of people who belong to the underclass, all they can do is serve each other because the new upper class, the digital upper class, no longer needs them.
Right.
And when you look at the netocrats, we call them informationalists. Those are the guys who collect information and process it. We call them sensocrats. The sensocrats are the guys who run the sensocracy. The sensocracy is the global network of sensors that measure absolutely everything in the world that happens, and therefore predicts your own behavior and your own desires and your own drive. And because they can do that through sensocracy, there's no point in you voting every 4 years for anything. Democracy is dead and over, and sensocracy takes over. The question is sensocracy going to be monistic, or is it going to be pluralistic, right? So that's what we're dealing with now philosophically. But you got informationalists, you got sensocrats, and you got a digital priesthood that then dictate the new narrative.
Right.
That's the netocracy for you. These are the people who will take over and run the world. And the question is, will they make this publicly known? Well, the question is, what do they gain from making it publicly known?
Right.
Because we're used to a power elite displaying their power. Opening a palace or building a skyscraper or having a Broadway show or a television show dedicated to them or whatever. But Donald Trump is like a parody of power today, because it's obvious that you pick a television star after you previously had a movie star as president of the United States when theater is all that's left in politics. And the only way to beat Donald Trump is to be more theatrical than he is, right? But that also means that's the end of politics. So politics is no longer where power is at.
Right.
That means the imaginary power that politics presented has now become ironic. And it's a bit like the Swedish king. We still got a king in Sweden. We'll laugh at him. He can't even vote. He's powerless. He doesn't have any money. We sleep around with him. We play around with him. We do whatever we want, because he's obviously he's just a remnant of a power of the past and is no longer powerful.
Okay,
That's exactly what's going to happen.
Let me ask one thing, because at the moment, the old power structures, politics, they are still the reigning power, because as we see in Corona, they dictate like how we go on the streets, how we take masks on. When will the time come that this is all...
Well, do they? No, do they really? I mean, do they? Who says they do?
Yeah, well, when I go on the street
any longer.
When I go on the street and it's locked down, then the police will come and will give me a fine. So it's still the old power structure which tries to steer my behavior. And so,
well, the sensocracy are certainly going to take over the police. If you haven't done that already in Spain, where you happen to live at the moment, they will. They've done that already in South Korea. Why do you think Towson and my team here in Stockholm go constantly to South Korea and Taiwan and these sort of high-tech countries where high-tech has been introduced, and we maybe try to save some kind of democracy or a plural sensocracy can be established? What we're looking at are alternatives to the Chinese dream of a monarch, dictatorial sensocracy. So we're looking at different ways to find a plural sensocracy. But the police is only the name for controlling human bodies inside a border, inside a membrane. The military is the way you try to control the outside world outside the very same membrane. So the military and the police are only names for something that's controlled by another power structure. And the idea that the politicians are still controlling the police forces of the world is becoming redundant, because the police forces are operating according to artificial intelligence that's tied to surveillance cameras you get everywhere you walk in the street, at least in London or Seoul already.
Right.
Possibly soon in Spain too. So we're already moving towards sensocracy. The idea that politicians are only theatrically making commentary on television screens to something they can no longer affect.
You think the shift has already taken place?
It's already happening on a massive scale. And the Corona proves it, because all Europe did, all Italy did when the Corona pandemic exploded in northern Italy, was to copy China and copy South Korea and mimic an Asian model, which turned out that, wait a second, we don't have the technology they have. And when he arrived in Germany, the same thing happened. We're going to try to copy the Koreans and maybe have to copy the Chinese. And it turns out, oh my God, we don't have the surveillance cameras they have. We don't have the apps on our smartphones they have. By the way, our Wi-Fi is crap. Finally, the Germans discovered they have crappy Wi-Fi. Okay, so they're beyond now. So all Europe started doing was to mimic East Asian countries. That's exactly what we studied Taiwan and South Korea. And the only countries in Europe that were on a par with Taiwan and South Korea and Japan when it came to Wi-Fi and sort of new sensocratic technologies were the Baltic countries and the Nordic countries in Northern Europe.
So you see Corona as a symptom that the power shift has already that the power shift is already on its way and already done.
Yeah. So the corona pandemic will be remembered as a big kick in the butt of the move towards digital. So I was saying throughout the 2010s, certain things are going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. And when the corona pandemic came along, it was just like, oh, wait, it's going to happen a lot faster. Okay. So the world stock exchanges fell 30%. NASDAQ went up. Okay.
Right.
Amazon, when everybody else fired people in America, and millions of people were suddenly unemployed, Amazon went out and hired hundreds of thousands of people.
Right.
Oh, okay. So we already know that the shift towards tech dramatically increased in speed because of the corona pandemic, because the corona pandemic exposed the weaknesses of the old power structure. Politicians, academia, and old industry could not respond to this crisis, whereas the informationalists, the censorocrats, and the digital priesthood could all make much better sense of it and act on it and had everything that everybody wanted. Every damn tech app you could find out there in the smartphone was a better way of fighting the pandemic than anybody plastering a little piece of paper with something written on it on a wooden tree somewhere in the city.
Right.
You couldn't publish anything in newspapers to fight the corona pandemic because everybody went online. Newspapers died. Okay, they're over. So academia died and it's over because academia is way too slow. So you're going to go for a vaccine, you're going to go for treatments, you're going to go for at least finding out who's got the virus, who doesn't, and antibodies and immunization, all the questions that were addressed throughout the spring of 2020 and all these issues that exploded. And it suddenly turned out the only way to answer these questions were the parallel studies where artificial intelligence connected thousands and thousands of people with their own reports about their own disease, their own communities, their own behavior to find out which model worked the best. And the world essentially became parallel experiments, right? These parallel experiments have nothing to do with politicians. Politicians are just a very small part that at best can only interfere and disturb with these processes. The less the politicians got involved, the better the models became. Now, that's the end of politics of anything.
So what do you make of all those apps, like distancing apps? And do you think that is something that will come necessarily, or is that you were in contact with a person who was infected 5 minutes ago, something like that? It's just like...
At the end of the day, pandemics like this go through rushes, they go through waves, they come back, and unless you got a vaccine, they come back and they haunt you again and again. You can't avoid it. And this is going to happen here too. And basically, you're going to learn from the corona pandemic, the people who took on the disease and had it and lived through it for the first 2 or 3 months of the whole thing, once they got immunized and were immunized for a few years, they were the winners. It's just, again, like, starting, what are you going to do when you go online? Well, allow yourself to make a few mistakes, but learn quickly. Right. That what you want this medium to be is of no interest to anybody. The medium itself decides what it wants to be. That's Marshall McLuhan, fundamental Marshall McLuhan media theory. The medium itself decides what it wants to be. All you can do is to try to be as human and as honest as possible and approach this medium and then optimize your relationship with that medium. And the medium itself speaks. The internet tells you straight away, I want you to return to being the tribal human being you've been for the last 200,000 years and ignore these sort of weirdo ideas about being a child of God and being an individual and being a collectivist or whatever we preach over the last 2,000 years or so. And just go back to something that's way older, more profound than that, being more human in your behavior, because we will guarantee you one thing, that the most humanly human out there stands the best chance of optimizing his chance or her chance of interacting with the machines, because the machines are going to be brilliant at being machines. And the only thing human beings can do then is try to be brilliant at being humans. That's how we optimize the human-machine relationship, and we call it symbiotic intelligence. And that's what we're moving towards, the age of symbiotic intelligence. And the most successful humans are netocrats within this network. And they then become either informationalists, which means you work with the data and process it. They become sensocrats, which means you work with actually containing the world. So you're an ecotopian. You want to create the nature of God or the garden of God on the planet. Then you emphasize that, and you put a network of sensors around the globe, and you get the data corrected from everywhere, and then you act upon that. Or you say, well, I want to work with people. Okay, you want to work with people. You want to create a sensocracy of people. The sensocracy of people is called cosmopolitanism, We can call it the city of God, and that's essentially the planet this time around. And the city of God is what you try to create. Then you might go for the eternal experiment, like I want infinitely experiment. I want to improve on things and work on things, including myself, my own tribe. Now, if you want to do that, that's sort of thing we could call the Tower of God. And that's just the third leg of what I would call the netocratic utopia, of the kind of world the netocrats want to create for themselves. And the question for you and me and all of those who engage with us is that how can we each in our netocratic tribe encourage each other to stay netocratic in our attitude and stay within any of these three modes to create this world?
Right. Alexander Bards, I think we got it. Thank you very much for doing this little podcast series on Digital Libido and all which is entailed. That was fun. Thank you.
Yeah.